April 1941. The Libyan Desert. 20,000 Australians are surrounded by Rommel's Afrika Korps. 300 German tanks against 2. The British have written them off. Military experts give them 2 weeks before total annihilation. And what do these diggers do? They steal enemy trucks in the middle of the night. They build bombs out of jam tins. They charge directly at panzers with bayonets fixed, and they hold that fortress for 242 days while the greatest military machine in the world throws everything it has at them. The Germans called them rats. The Australians said thanks very much and carved rat badges out of shell casings. But here is what the official histories do not tell you. How exactly do you stop a 50-ton tank with a tin can full of gelignite? What made Italian commanders beg not to be positioned opposite Australian lines? And why did captured German officers refuse to believe they had been beaten by sheep shearers and farm boys? There is a moment in this story when a German panzer commander watches Australian soldiers charging his tanks and genuinely thinks he has encountered a new secret weapon. He had not. He had encountered something far more dangerous. Men who simply refused to accept that they were supposed to lose. Stay with me. Because what these diggers pulled off at Tobruk rewrote the rules of desert warfare. And by the end of this video, you will understand exactly why Rommel himself admitted he could not break them. The night of April 10th, 1941, a German panzer commander peered through his field glasses at the Tobruk perimeter and saw something that made absolutely no sense. Australian soldiers were charging directly at his tanks. Not retreating, not digging in, charging, with bayonets fixed and what appeared to be tin cans in their hands. The commander gave the order to advance, confident this would be a slaughter. 48 hours later, 17 of his tanks were burning wrecks, and the survivors were retreating in confusion, convinced they had encountered some new form of Allied weapon. They had not. They had encountered diggers with empty jam tins stuffed with gelignite and a complete disregard for what professional soldiers considered possible. This is the story that Hollywood will never tell you, not because it lacks drama, but because the heroes were not Americans with unlimited supplies and air support. They were 20,000 Australians with rifles older than some of their fathers, artillery pieces that belonged in museums, and exactly 2 functioning tanks between them. They held Tobruk for 242 days against Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, the most feared fighting force in the world. And they did it with stolen trucks, homemade bombs, and a tactical philosophy that drove German military planners absolutely mad. But this was merely the first act of a siege that would rewrite the rules of desert warfare forever. The strategic situation in early April 1941 could not have been more catastrophic for the Allied cause. Rommel had arrived in North Africa just 2 months earlier, and already his panzers had swept across Libya like a sandstorm made of steel. The British forces, exhausted and outmaneuvered, had collapsed in retreat after retreat. Benghazi fell. Derna fell. The 8th Army was running east so fast that supply depots were being abandoned with their contents still intact. Every military analyst in London and Berlin agreed on one simple fact. Tobruk would fall within 2 weeks, 3 at most. The harbor was the prize Rommel needed. With Tobruk in German hands, the road to Cairo lay open, and Egypt, the Suez Canal, and the entire Middle East would follow. Winston Churchill sent a single message to the Tobruk garrison. There is to be no surrender and no retreat. The message arrived at the headquarters of Major General Leslie Morshead, commander of the Australian 9th Division. Morshead read it, nodded, and then did something that would have horrified the British High Command if they had known. He threw away virtually everything the British had taught him about defensive warfare. What he did next would change everything. The standard British doctrine for holding a fortified position was simple and had worked since the trenches of the First World War. You dig in, you hold the line, you wait for relief. You do not expose your troops unnecessarily. You do not conduct aggressive operations that might provoke the enemy. You conserve strength and hope that reinforcements arrive before your position becomes untenable. Morshead looked at this doctrine, looked at his 20,000 men facing over 300 German tanks, and announced his own tactical philosophy in terms every Australian farmer would understand. No grub gets fat in a hole, he reportedly told his officers. If we sit and wait, they will dig us out like rabbits. We go out there every night, and we bite them. The Germans were about to discover what that meant in practice. The first problem was equipment, or rather the complete lack of it. The 9th Division had arrived in North Africa, expecting to complete their training before seeing combat. Instead, Rommel's lightning advance had thrown them into the fight months ahead of schedule. Their equipment manifest read like a catalog of military poverty. They had rifles, mostly the venerable Lee Enfield, reliable but hardly cutting edge for 1941. They had machine guns, though not nearly enough of them. They had artillery pieces, some dating back to the previous war, with ammunition stocks that quartermasters described in terms of days rather than weeks. Anti-tank weapons were almost non-existent. The Boy's anti-tank rifle, standard issue for British Empire forces, was a joke against German armor. Its rounds bounced off panzer hulls like pebbles thrown at a battleship. And then there were the tanks. The 9th Division's armored support consisted of exactly 2 Matilda tanks, one of which had a transmission that ground and shrieked every time it changed gears. British officers who inspected the Tobruk defenses before the siege began wrote reports expressing serious concern about the garrison's ability to hold for even a few days. One memo, preserved in the Australian War Memorial Archives, noted that the Australian force lacks the material means to conduct a sustained defense against armored assault. The officer who wrote it recommended immediate evacuation of all personnel before Rommel could close the trap. Morshead read that report too. His response was not recorded officially, but several of his staff officers later recalled that it involved profanity and a suggestion about what the British officer could do with his recommendation. But here is where the story takes its first unexpected turn. The lack of proper equipment was about to become the Australians' greatest strategic advantage, though nobody realized it yet. The Tobruk perimeter stretched for approximately 47 kilometers around the port, a vast arc of desert that the Italians had previously fortified with concrete bunkers, tank traps, and barbed wire. The fortifications were substantial, but had been designed for a much larger garrison. Morshead's 20,000 men were spread dangerously thin, with some sectors having fewer than 1 soldier for every 10 meters of front. A determined assault at any point could theoretically break through before reserves could arrive. Rommel knew this. His staff had calculated exactly where the Australian line was weakest. The attack plans were drawn up with German precision, targeting 3 specific sectors where a concentrated panzer thrust would punch through to the harbor within hours. What Rommel did not know, what his intelligence had completely failed to grasp, was that these Australians had no intention of waiting in their bunkers to be attacked. And what happened next would haunt German commanders for months. The first night patrol went out on April 11, 1941, less than 24 hours after the siege began. 30 men from the 2nd 17th Battalion, faces blackened with dirt and bootlaces wrapped around their boots to muffle sound, crawled through gaps in their own wire and disappeared into the darkness toward the German lines. They carried rifles, bayonets, and a collection of homemade grenades that the battalion quartermaster had refused to officially acknowledge existed. These were the famous jam tin bombs, improvised explosives assembled from empty food containers packed with gelignite and nails, with fuses cut short enough to allow throwing, but long enough, usually, to avoid blowing up in the thrower's hand. The official British Ordnance Manual contained no specifications for jam tin bombs. That was because British soldiers were not supposed to make their own explosives from scrounged materials like deranged bush mechanics. The patrol reached the German forward positions shortly after midnight. What happened next set the pattern for the entire siege. The Germans had established a comfortable routine. Their forward observers occupied sandbag positions about 800 meters from the Australian perimeter, close enough to direct artillery fire, but far enough to feel secure from infantry attack. They had searchlights, machine guns, and radio contact with tanks that could respond to any threat within minutes. No sane infantry force would assault such a position at night without overwhelming numerical superiority and detailed planning. The Australians had neither. They had 30 men, tin can bombs, and a profound disrespect for what professional soldiers considered possible. The first the Germans knew of the attack was when 2 jam tin bombs sailed over their sandbags and exploded among the communication equipment. Then the Australians were among them with bayonets, and the screaming started. The engagement lasted less than 5 minutes. 7 Germans were no longer breathing, 4 wounded, 2 captured. Radio equipment was destroyed. One machine gun was dragged back to Australian lines as a trophy. Australian casualties were 2 men with minor wounds. The patrol was back behind their own wire before German reinforcements even began moving forward. But this was only the beginning of a nightmare the Afrika Korps had never experienced before. The German response to this new form of warfare revealed just how unprepared they were to face the Australian tactical philosophy. Rommel's commanders demanded more searchlights, more forward observers, more patrols to secure their perimeter at night. All of this was provided. None of it helped. The Australians learned to time their raids to the gaps between searchlight sweeps. They crawled through terrain that German observers swore was impassable. They attacked from directions that should have been covered by overlapping fields of fire, somehow finding the dead spots that existed in even the most carefully planned defensive systems. The key to understanding Australian success in these night operations lay not in superior training or special equipment, but in something far more difficult for the Germans to counter. These men had grown up in a landscape that made the Libyan desert look hospitable. They had learned to move silently while hunting kangaroos in the scrub. They had learned to navigate by stars while walking fence lines in the outback. They had learned patience while waiting for rain that might not come for years. Skills that seemed useless in modern mechanized warfare turned out to be devastatingly effective when applied to night infantry operations. One captured German officer, interrogated after a particularly devastating raid on his company headquarters, reportedly asked his captors a question that perfectly summarized the Wehrmacht's confusion. "How do your men see in the dark?" He had watched Australian soldiers move through a moonless night with the confidence of men walking through their own homes. His own troops, many of them city-bred conscripts from the industrial regions of Germany, stumbled and fumbled in the same darkness. The answer, which no German intelligence report ever quite grasped, was that rural Australian boys had been navigating dark paddocks since childhood. Darkness was not their enemy, it was their friend, and yet the night raids were only one weapon in the Australian arsenal. The matter of the Italian trucks deserves special attention because it illustrates perfectly the Australian talent for making do with whatever materials came to hand. When the siege began, the 9th Division had almost no motorized transport. Their vehicles had been lost in the chaotic retreat that preceded the siege, abandoned on roadsides when fuel ran out or engines failed. Moving troops quickly to threatened sectors of the perimeter required vehicles that did not exist. The British solution would have been to request replacement vehicles through official channels, a process that would take months if it succeeded at all. The Australian solution was considerably more direct. During the opening days of the siege, several Australian patrols noticed that German and Italian units were using captured British vehicles painted with Afrika Korps markings. This gave someone, the original genius remains unidentified, an interesting idea. If the enemy could use captured vehicles, why couldn't the Australians do the same? The fact that this would require stealing vehicles from a force that was currently trying to surround and destroy them was apparently considered a minor logistical challenge, rather than a fundamental obstacle. What followed was audacity bordering on madness. The first truck acquisition operation took place on April 14th. A patrol from the 2nd 13th Battalion located an Italian supply convoy that had stopped for the night approximately 3 kilometers outside the perimeter. The convoy was guarded, but not heavily. Italian troops in North Africa had not yet learned to fear Australian night operations the way their German allies would soon learn. Shortly after 2 in the morning, 10 Australians crawled to within 30 meters of the parked vehicles. At a whispered signal, they rushed the convoy simultaneously from 3 directions. The Italian guards, startled from sleep, had barely grasped their weapons before they found bayonets at their throats. 8 trucks were captured that night, along with their contents, which included tinned meat, pasta, wine, and, to the great delight of the raiders, a crate of hand grenades that were considerably more reliable than jam tin bombs. The trucks were driven back to Australian lines before dawn, repainted with Australian markings by afternoon, and deployed for troop movement by nightfall. Italian headquarters reported the convoy as destroyed by enemy action, apparently too embarrassed to admit that it had simply been stolen. But the diggers were only getting started with their shopping expeditions. Over the following weeks, Australian patrols brought back an astonishing variety of captured equipment. More trucks, dozens of them, ranging from small utility vehicles to heavy transports. motorcycles that had belonged to German dispatch riders who would never deliver another message, field telephones and radio equipment that Australian signalers adapted for their own use, medical supplies that the Tobruk hospital desperately needed, food always welcome given the monotonous siege diet of bully beef and hardtack, ammunition carefully sorted by caliber and distributed to units that could use captured weapons. One particularly audacious raid brought back an entire field kitchen, complete with cooking equipment and a 3-day supply of fresh bread. The kitchen had been supporting an Italian artillery battery whose gunners woke to find their breakfast missing, along with their cooks. Australian soldiers ate hot meals prepared in a stolen kitchen using stolen food, and the black humor of the situation was not lost on men who had expected to be starving within weeks of the siege beginning. The German and Italian commands grew increasingly concerned about these raids. Security was tightened, convoys were given heavier guards, supply dumps were moved further from the front lines. None of these measures proved effective. The Australians simply ranged further, stayed out longer, and accepted greater risks to maintain their supply of liberated equipment. One patrol spent 3 days behind enemy lines, traveling over 60 kilometers on foot before locating and ambushing a fuel convoy that the garrison desperately needed. They returned with 4 trucks loaded with petrol, having lost only 1 man to a mine. The official history of the campaign notes that captured vehicles eventually made up a significant portion of the 9th Division's transport pool. Yet all of this was merely preparation for the real test that was coming. The Australian approach to armor defense at Tobruk violated every principle that staff colleges had taught for 20 years. Standard doctrine held that anti-tank defenses should be concentrated in depth, with infantry positioned well back from expected armor approaches and artillery registered on kill zones where tanks could be engaged from multiple directions. This doctrine assumed adequate anti-tank guns, which Tobruk did not have, and assumed that infantry could not directly engage tanks without unacceptable casualties. The Australians had different ideas. Mooreshead's defensive concept divided the perimeter into sectors, each assigned to a battalion with clear responsibility for both holding the line and conducting offensive operations in their area. But the key innovation was the response protocol for armored attack. Instead of pulling infantry back when tanks appeared, the Australians were ordered to stand fast in their positions, let the tanks pass over them, and then deal with the German infantry that followed, while other units attacked the tanks from the flanks and rear. This required extraordinary discipline. Soldiers had to remain in foxholes, while 50-ton vehicles rolled directly over their positions, trusting that the tank commanders would not notice them, and that the soil would not collapse under the weight of steel treads. The first major test of this tactic came on April 14th, during what German records called the Easter Battle, and what happened that day would shatter German confidence in their own superiority. Rommel committed the entire 5th Light Division to a frontal assault on the southwestern sector of the perimeter, sending 80 tanks against positions held by the 2nd 24th Battalion. The attack began at dawn with a heavy artillery barrage that churned the desert into clouds of dust and smoke. Then the panzers advanced, black crosses visible on their turrets, machine guns chattering as they approached the Australian lines. The first wave of tanks reached the Australian forward positions and found them apparently empty. Foxholes had been abandoned. Weapon pits showed no sign of defenders. The tank commanders reported that the Australians had fled, broken by the artillery barrage. This assessment proved premature. The Australians were still there, pressed into the bottoms of their holes, waiting with grenades in their hands and jammed tin bombs tucked under their bodies. As the tanks rolled past, as their engine noise faded and their exhaust fumes dissipated, the diggers emerged and went to work on the German infantry following behind. The fighting that followed defied conventional military description. Australian soldiers attacked German panzer grenadiers with bayonets, while tanks maneuvered in confusion behind them, unable to fire on their own troops, but unwilling to advance without infantry support. Jammed tin bombs arced through the air toward tank tracks and engine compartments. Anti-tank rifles that were useless against frontal armor found shots at rear gratings and ventilation ports as tanks turned to face threats from unexpected directions. By midday, 17 German tanks were disabled or destroyed, most of them by infantry weapons that should have been harmless against armored vehicles. The German officers who survived this engagement were professionally horrified. Their tanks had achieved what should have been a decisive breakthrough, only to find themselves surrounded by infantry who refused to behave like infantry was supposed to behave. One captured tank commander stated that he had believed he was facing some new form of Allied special forces, elite troops equipped with experimental anti-tank weapons. When informed that his tank had been destroyed by farmers and shopkeepers using homemade explosives, he reportedly refused to believe it. But Rommel was not a man who accepted defeat easily. The siege of Tobruk settled into a pattern that would persist for months, though neither side found the pattern comfortable. By day, artillery dueled across the perimeter, German shells searching for Australian positions that seemed to move constantly. Australian shells carefully rationed because supply ships could not deliver ammunition fast enough to permit wasteful bombardment. By night, Australian patrols went out into the darkness, bringing back prisoners, supplies, and a constant stream of intelligence about German positions and intentions. The living conditions within the perimeter became increasingly difficult as the siege extended beyond the few weeks that both sides had initially expected. Water was rationed strictly, with each man allowed approximately 1 gallon per day for drinking, cooking, and all personal hygiene. Soldiers learned to shave using sand when water ran short, and laundry became a distant memory. Flies descended in biblical swarms, covering food the moment it was exposed, crawling into eyes and nostrils and wounds with relentless persistence. Dysentery spread through the garrison despite all medical efforts to control it, leaving men weakened but still expected to fight. The food situation deteriorated steadily. Supply ships could only run the gauntlet of German aircraft during dark nights, and their cargoes had to include ammunition, medicine, and replacement equipment, as well as rations. The standard Tobruk diet became bully beef and hardtack biscuits, varied occasionally by whatever Australian patrols could steal from enemy supply dumps. One battalion historian recorded that the most popular item brought back from night raids was not weapons or ammunition, but tinned Italian fruit, which became currency more valuable than money within the perimeter. And then came the psychological warfare that would define the digger spirit. German propaganda attempted to exploit these conditions, broadcasting offers of surrender terms that included medical treatment and regular meals. The Australians responded in characteristic fashion. Lord Haw Haw's radio program announced that the Tobruk garrison was caught like rats in a trap, and the diggers immediately adopted the insult as a badge of honor. Rat badges appeared throughout the garrison, crafted from scrap metal and spent shell casings. A newsletter called The Dinkum Oil began publication, featuring news of the siege, written with a gallows humor that British censors found alarming, but Australian troops found hilarious. One typical article described a new restaurant opening in the perimeter, featuring a menu of bully beef, served rare, medium, or burnt, accompanied by vintage water from the finest local wells. The psychological warfare extended beyond mere jokes. Australian commanders understood that maintaining morale required keeping their troops active, rather than allowing them to stagnate in defensive positions. The nightly patrols served this purpose as much as they served tactical objectives. Men who spent their nights stalking enemy positions felt less like besieged victims and more like hunters who happened to be working from a fixed camp. The raids gave purpose to the misery, direction to the anger, and stories to tell in the brief rest periods between operations. But the Desert Fox was planning something that would test the rats to their absolute limit. The major German assault of May 1, 1941, represented everything that had made the Afrika Korps feared across North Africa. Rommel concentrated over 100 tanks against a single sector of the perimeter, planning to punch through the Australian defenses with overwhelming force before the garrison could react. The attack was supported by the heaviest artillery bombardment yet seen at Tobruk, with German and Italian guns laying down a curtain of steel that made the earlier Easter barrage look like a warm-up exercise. The sector chosen for the assault was held by the 2nd 24th Battalion, the same unit that had endured the Easter battle. These men were exhausted, depleted by casualties and sickness, operating on minimal sleep and inadequate rations. By any reasonable military calculation, they should have been unable to withstand another major attack. The German planners had made exactly this calculation. They expected the weakened battalion to collapse under the concentrated assault, opening a gap that the panzers could exploit before Australian reserves arrived. What they got instead was 8 hours of hell. The attack began at dawn on May 1st with a barrage that lasted 90 minutes. Australian soldiers huddled in their foxholes as the desert around them erupted in continuous explosions, the noise so overwhelming that men later reported they could not hear their own screaming. When the barrage lifted, the tanks came forward, wave after wave of German armor, advancing in textbook formations, their guns already firing at suspected defensive positions. What followed was 8 hours of close-quarters combat that stretched even Australian endurance to the breaking point. Tanks breached the perimeter wire at multiple points, penetrating deep into the defensive zone before running into prepared positions that had survived the bombardment. Infantry fighting swirled around knocked-out vehicles and collapsed bunkers, with neither side able to establish clear control of the disputed ground. Australian anti-tank teams, working in pairs with jammed tin bombs and captured German grenades, stalked panzers through the dust and smoke like hunters tracking wounded animals. The critical moment came in the early afternoon when German tanks reached the Ras El Mador feature, a small hill that dominated the western approaches to Tobruk harbor. If this position fell, German artillery would have direct observation over the port facilities, making supply operations virtually impossible. The garrison would face slow strangulation, even if immediate defeat could be avoided. Everything depended on holding Ras El Mador until reinforcements could arrive. And now came the moment that would define the entire siege. The defense of Ras El Mador fell to a company of the 2nd 43rd Battalion that had been held in reserve for exactly this situation. Approximately 150 men against a German force that included at least 30 tanks and supporting infantry. The odds were not encouraging. The company commander, a former sheep station manager from Queensland, gathered his men for brief instructions that reportedly consisted of 3 sentences. Hold this hill. Do not let them take this hill. Everything else is details. The fighting for Ras El Mador lasted until darkness made further operations impossible. German tanks approached the position repeatedly, only to be driven back by concentrated fire from weapons that should have been ineffective against armor. The Australians had positioned their few anti-tank rifles to cover the most vulnerable approaches, and their gunners had learned from hard experience exactly where to aim for maximum effect. When anti-tank ammunition ran low, infantry teams crawled forward with explosives, destroying tracks and jamming turret rings with grenades thrown from suicidally close range. By nightfall, 8 German tanks were burning on the slopes of Ras El Mador. The Australian company had lost 43 men, but the hill remained in Australian hands. More importantly, the German breakthrough had stalled. The corridor they had opened in the perimeter during the morning had not been exploited quickly enough, and Australian reserves were now moving to seal the gap. Rommel's most ambitious assault had achieved tactical penetration, but strategic failure. The price of that failure would echo through the rest of the campaign. The aftermath of the May offensive revealed something that troubled German planners far more than the tactical setback itself. The Australians had taken significant casualties but showed no signs of weakening morale or declining combat effectiveness. Units that had been mauled in the fighting reorganized and returned to action within days. Individual soldiers who had witnessed comrades fall beside them volunteered for the most dangerous night patrol assignments. The garrison, that should have been psychologically broken by months of siege and repeated assaults instead, seemed to grow more determined with each German failure. Intelligence officers questioning captured Australians encountered an attitude that defied standard military psychology. These prisoners were not fanatical ideologues sustained by political conviction, nor professional soldiers committed to military honor. They were farmers and tradesmen and clerks who freely admitted they wanted nothing more than to go home to Australia and never see another desert. Yet they refused to surrender, refused to show fear, and exhibited a resilience that German psychologists struggled to explain. One interrogation report, translated and preserved in the Australian War Memorial, provides a striking example. The German officer asked a captured Australian private why he continued to fight when defeat was clearly inevitable. The Australian replied that he did not think defeat was inevitable at all. When pressed to explain how 20,000 men with inadequate equipment could hope to resist the Afrika Korps indefinitely, the prisoner reportedly shrugged and said that the Germans had not beaten them yet, and he reckoned they would not beat them tomorrow either. The interrogator noted in his report that this attitude was typical of Australian prisoners and represented a form of morale that did not respond to conventional pressure. But there was something deeper that the Germans never understood. The explanation for this resilience lay not in military training or political indoctrination, but in something deeper that the German army was fundamentally unable to comprehend. These Australians had grown up in a culture that valued loyalty to mates above almost everything else, including personal survival. A man who abandoned his position under fire was not merely failing his duty. He was betraying his mates, the most serious crime in the Australian moral universe. The bonds formed in the months of shared hardship had created a network of obligations that no amount of German pressure could break. Each man held his position because leaving would mean abandoning the men on either side of him. Now saw, and that was simply unthinkable. The mateship that sustained Australian resistance operated at every level of the garrison, creating connections that the formal military hierarchy barely recognized. And nowhere was this bond stronger than between the diggers and the sailors who kept them alive. The story of the Tobruk ferry service illustrates how solidarity extended beyond the combat units to include everyone who supported the siege. The Royal Australian Navy destroyers that ran supplies and reinforcements into Tobruk faced hazards that made the perimeter itself seem almost safe. German aircraft controlled the skies during daylight hours, forcing the destroyers to operate only during the darkest nights. Even then, Italian torpedo boats and German submarines patrolled the approaches, and the harbor itself was under constant artillery fire. Each run into Tobruk was a gamble with survival. The sailors who crewed these vessels developed a fierce pride in their contribution to the siege. They called themselves the Scrap Iron Flotilla, another insult turned badge of honor after German propaganda dismissed their obsolete destroyers as fit only for the scrap heap. These aging vessels, most of them built during or shortly after the First World War, ran the gauntlet repeatedly throughout the siege, bringing in reinforcements, taking out wounded, and maintaining the tenuous supply line that kept the garrison alive. One destroyer captain later wrote that his most vivid memory of Tobruk was not the enemy fire, but the reaction of the garrison troops each time a ship reached the harbor. Men who had been living on half rations in holes in the ground would gather on the mole to help unload supplies. Working through the night to empty the ship before dawn made further operations too dangerous. There was never any shortage of volunteers for this work, despite the exhaustion and the constant risk of air attack. The sailors brought news from the outside world, letters from home, and most importantly, proof that the garrison had not been forgotten. The connection between the Navy and the garrison grew into something that transcended normal military relationships. Destroyer crews learned to recognize specific Army units by their positions on the mole. Army soldiers learned to identify individual ships by their silhouettes in the darkness. When HMAS Parramatta was lost to a submarine torpedo in November 1941, with 138 of her crew perishing at sea, the news affected garrison morale more than any German artillery bombardment had managed. These were not strangers who had been lost. They were mates who had shared the danger and the determination that defined life at Tobruk. But now the siege was entering its final chapter, and history was about to deliver its verdict. The strategic situation in the Mediterranean theater shifted dramatically in the second half of 1941. Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union in June drew resources and attention away from North Africa, forcing Rommel to make do with inadequate supplies and reinforcements for his assault on Egypt. At the same time, British forces in Egypt were finally receiving the tanks and aircraft they needed to mount an effective counteroffensive. The siege of Tobruk, which had begun as a desperate holding action, had achieved its strategic purpose. Rommel had been denied his prize for long enough that the entire North African campaign now hung in the balance. The Australian government, meanwhile, had grown increasingly uncomfortable with the extended deployment of the 9th Division. Prime Minister John Curtin, newly elected and acutely aware of the Japanese threat building in the Pacific, demanded that Australian troops be released from Tobruk for the defense of their homeland. Churchill resisted, arguing that the garrison could not be relieved until the planned British offensive was ready. Weeks of diplomatic tension followed, with Curtin threatening to withdraw Australian forces entirely from the Mediterranean theater if his demands were not met. The compromise eventually reached allowed for gradual relief of the Australian garrison, with fresh troops replacing the exhausted 9th Division in stages during September and October 1941. The relief operation required the same dangerous night runs that had sustained the siege, now complicated by the need to move thousands of men in both directions through enemy-controlled waters. Each night brought a calculation of risk, a weighing of how many men could be embarked against the likelihood of detection and attack. The last Australian units departed Tobruk on October 25, 1941, 242 days after the siege began. They left behind a garrison that had suffered nearly 3,500 casualties, counting those who would never return, those who carried wounds, and those taken prisoner. They also left behind something less tangible, but equally important. They left behind a reputation. German military intelligence reports from the Tobruk siege consistently overestimated Australian strength and capabilities. Rommel himself, in documents captured after the war, described the Australians as savage fighters whose aggressive patrolling made normal operations impossible. Italian commanders requested repeatedly that their units not be positioned opposite Australian sectors, claiming that their troops could not match the enemy's ferocity. A mythology had been born in the desert, a mythology that would influence German and Italian planning for the remainder of the North African campaign. And now comes the truth that official histories rarely mention. The most important legacy of Tobruk was carried home in the minds and memories of the men who had held the fortress against everything the enemy could throw at them. The Rats of Tobruk, as they proudly called themselves for the rest of their lives, had proven something that military professionals had doubted. They had proven that determination and ingenuity could compensate for material weakness. They had proven that aggressive defense could neutralize the advantages of armor and firepower. Most importantly, from the Australian perspective, they had proven that the digger spirit forged at Gallipoli had not diminished in the generation since the First World War. The men who returned from Tobruk spoke little about their experiences to anyone who had not shared them. This reticence was characteristic of Australian veterans generally, but the Tobruk survivors seemed particularly reluctant to discuss what they had endured. When pressed, they would typically deflect attention from their own actions to praise their mates, living and fallen. The pattern of credit sharing and self-deprecation that anthropologists would later identify as central to Australian culture found its purest expression in these conversations. One veteran, interviewed for an oral history project decades after the war, was asked what he was most proud of from his time at Tobruk. His answer captured something essential about the Australian experience of the siege. He said he was most proud that when things got bad, really bad, nobody ran. Not once. Everyone stuck. He added that there was nothing special about them individually. They were just blokes who did not want to let their mates down. That was all there was to it. The military historians would eventually write their analyses of the Tobruk siege, evaluating tactics and strategies, counting tanks, and calculating artillery ratios. They would note that the Australian defense succeeded because of superior use of terrain, innovative anti-tank tactics, and aggressive patrolling that disrupted enemy operations. All of this was true and important, but it missed something that the veterans themselves understood perfectly. The siege of Tobruk was won by men who refused to accept that they were beaten, no matter what the professional soldiers and military analysts said. It was won by men who would rather fall in a foxhole than leave a wounded mate behind. It was won by men who answered the problem of having no tanks by stealing enemy trucks and making bombs out of jam tins. It was won by the same stubborn bloody-mindedness that had built farms in impossible country and survived droughts that broke stronger men. The general got a medal for the map he drew. The diggers got a legend that would outlast them all. Anyone who knew them could tell you who really won that siege. The desert has changed little in the decades since the guns fell silent. Tourists can still visit the Tobruk perimeter, walking the same ground where 20,000 Australians held off the Afrika Korps for 242 days. The bunkers have crumbled, the wire has rusted away, and the shell craters have softened into gentle depressions in the sand. But something lingers there, in the quality of the silence, that speaks to visitors who come looking for the story. They came from sheep stations and wheat farms, from the suburbs of Melbourne and the mining towns of Queensland, They had no experience of mechanized warfare, no training for desert conditions, no expectation that they would be asked to hold a fortress against the most feared army in the world. They had rifles, courage, and each other. Against all reasonable expectations, against all professional military judgment, it was enough. No tanks? No problem. The rats of Tobruk had made their own rules, and Rommel, the desert fox himself, the commander who had never been stopped by any force in Europe or Africa, had been forced to admit that he could not break men who fought with jam-tin bombs and refused to stay in their holes like proper soldiers were supposed to do. His private correspondence reveals a grudging respect that bordered on fascination. Who were these Australians who attacked tanks with bayonets and stole supplies from under the noses of his sentries? Where did they find the nerve to raid his positions night after night when they should have been cowering in their bunkers waiting for relief? The answer was simple, though it took German intelligence the entire siege to understand it. They were diggers. They looked after their mates. They did not quit. Everything else was just details.